So, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here for this session, for this exclusive session on checklists on gender monitoring as a tool to improve representation for all. This morning, I have two distinguished speakers with me. I have Amy Viss. She's the program coordinator at Free Press Unlimited on the project Media Action in Jordan. Amy has been actively involved in managing and implementing multi-stakeholder projects across the MENA region and in Pakistan. She also focuses on accountability, safety for journalists, and media sustainability. I'm also joined by Huda Osman. She's the executive editor at Arij. She's also the New York-based freelance journalist and trainer. She is also a trainer on investigative journalism since 2008. She has worked in media outlets, basically from France 24, PBS, CBS News. She's also the president of the Arab and the Middle Eastern Journalists Association. So good morning, ladies, and thank you for being here with me today. Okay. I will start with the first question with Amy, and I will talk about the toolbox that you have created. When we talk about media monitoring, we talk about gender-sensitive language. How did you start the process, especially in Jordan? How did you work on that?
Yeah, thank you, Ruba. I think maybe to give a bit of context, as you say, I work at Free Press Unlimited, which is a press freedom media development organization in the Netherlands. And we have been involved in different activities surrounding gender media monitoring for many years. And particularly for me, I've always been interested in how we place this into a broader program on inclusion and also on representative and sensitive media content. So that's how I've framed also this activity that we started in Jordan this year, actually. So we're still quite in the early-ish days. And I think also to come to what you mentioned, a toolbox, that's really how we also perceive it. And that's also how we came a bit to the title of this exercise, that sometimes things like gender media monitoring, because they are quite research-based, can be seen as a checklist. Okay, we made a report, we did some research, now it's finished. And really tried to frame it more as a tool in your toolbox. It can be quite a technical tool, but it shouldn't be just an exercise. It should be part of a larger program looking into how media organizations really understand what does this mean, gender-sensitive language, but also more broadly inclusive language, and how can they actually use the data or the information that comes out of such reports to improve their content and also improve the capacity in working with their journalists. So that's really how we approached it. And I think that, still in this early stage, one of the things that we already see is that it really touches on a lot of different areas. So quite often it can be thought that, okay, you're doing a gender media monitoring activity, it's really about gender, or even more so, it's really about women. Okay. And really that's not the case. We see that it touches a lot on actually the values of, journalistic professionalism, good quality journalism. It's also a tool in improving the way that journalists work. So that's how we've been approaching it. And we've done so far only a baseline research here in Jordan, and we hope to build on that further. But I think we'll speak on that a little later.
Well, we're talking about media as, the tool itself. And when we talk about tools, we talk to journalists about how you improve your work, you improve your content. So we're talking here about awareness. So from the awareness aspect that the tool is bringing, what kind of content can the tool bring to the journalists when you are writing, when you're doing all of kind of work, especially from a gender-sensitive perspective?
Thank you, Ruba. If you don't mind, can I tell everyone first how this was done, so it's like more, you understand better how the exercise itself is done. So in this past July, over the course of 3 days, we had 5 so-called, for this exercise, they're called monitors, but they're actually 5 journalists, 5 Jordanian journalists. It was important for us to have Jordanian journalists who understand, who live here, and they understand the context, because the monitoring was going to be of the Jordanian media. We agreed on 13 media outlets, and the selection was done together with FPU, myself, but also with a lot of input from the monitors, the journalists themselves. And it was a wide range of media organizations, from, independent to more, official ones. And we agreed on a number of questions, number of things that we're going to look for into each article that we're going to be analyzing. And these included, for example, is the author of the article, is the journalist, the writer, female or male? What is the topic? What is the main topic and what is the secondary topic? Is there an obvious stereotype in the article? Does the article relate to gender in any way? Also, one of the most important questions were related to what we call in the monitoring exercise actors. Actors are like the subjects in this article, the main subjects of the article, the sources. Are they male or female? And not just like, their gender identity, but also what role are they playing? Is it like a main role or not? So over the course of the 3 days, we analyzed 236 articles. For each article, we went through all of these questions. And in the end, we did an analysis and came with some conclusions that we're going to maybe speak about later. But to come back to your question, in terms of this benefiting how it affects the journalistic work itself, I think it's a very good exercise in allowing journalists to be conscious of how they are doing the reporting. It wasn't just like straight, news reporting. There was analysis, there were investigations, there were opinion pieces, but just to be conscious of how the reporting is done with regards to, gender sensitivity. But I feel like it's not just specific to that. Once you do this exercise and you analyze like in detail, like some of the aspects of all these like written, articles, you become conscious of other things as well. And I can talk about this later.
So to pick up on Huda's question and Huda's input on how you can think of it, the representation matter. This is what is the most important thing about the tool, that it's about representation, and the representation of women and men, and the representation of all of the minorities that exist in society. So this question will be for both of you. So when you are working with the tool, how do you take into accountability, or how do you take into consideration what kind of representation you want to seek, and do you discover actually new kinds of representation while working?
Yeah. Maybe I'll start. I think it's a very interesting point that you raise, Ruba, because actually for me, it brings it into why I think this kind of tool is a really interesting exercise to work now directly with media outlets. So that's a little bit the next step. We did this research also really to have a baseline and also to place it in context. We've been involved in previous years with the Global Media Monitoring Project and other larger media monitoring efforts. And the ambition here within the major program is really to place it in something that's a bit more frequent, that really allows for reflection with journalists themselves and with media outlets themselves. And I think that there, what we see, to your question about how do you make it really about the accountability of that representation, it's really an adaptive tool. So our ambition now is also to reach out with outlets and understand and adapt and tailor these tools to what are their sort of challenges or ambitions when it comes to representation. And as I said before, it does not only need to be gender. Actually, the same toolbox can be adapted to any kind of thing that you want to monitor in your content. And particularly when it comes to media outlets, what I really want to stress here today also is that I think doing this kind of monitoring, it's already in the DNA of media. Even if they're not using such research tools, one of the things we talked about quite a lot is that to try and pull it a bit away from this maybe project, research, checklist kind of exercise, I want to be able to support media in their efforts to actually understand their audience, to understand is their content reaching the audiences that they want to reach, or are they maybe unconsciously producing content that, for certain parts of the audience, and this we're looking particularly at women, is unconsciously reproducing biases or stereotypes. So this part of it, I think, is where you really see the potential for impact when working directly with media outlets. And I hope that that's something that, in the coming year, we will really set up from this, not just in Jordan, but in the region. And there we can tailor it to whatever, specific needs or specific wishes there are of an outlet. And it should really be something that is living. That's why I say, for me, the tool doesn't really matter. There are so many different developments in this in previous years. People even want to use AI to monitor their content. Any tool for me is fine, as long as it's something that really lives within the journalist or the outlet who are using it, that they understand how did we come to this tool? Why are we researching these specific things? When you say a stereotype, what does that look like? Because I might see gender stereotypes being very different than a journalist that we're speaking to. So that for me is the really important part of what we're trying to do.
Huda?
I think it's important to stress that the idea or the approach is not to go out and have a certain model and check, the local media or like the journal media against this model and find mistakes. The idea is to learn and to explore and to understand how, this is being covered, what is the role of women or gender in the articles, and out of this conclusion, the conclusions that we try to improve or try to find ways to improve the reporting so it's really extremely important, especially because, and we've had actually, Amy and I, we've had discussions about, some of the reporting, some of the articles we were analyzing, they are reflective of society. So for example, I'll give you like some concrete, so we'd be looking at an article, there was an article about public gyms like in public areas. And everyone who was interviewed in this article was a man. But then we were thinking, okay, but like the reality is that women are not gonna go to these like public outdoor, this just doesn't really happen. So for the journalist to go out and find a woman to interview about this would be sort of, not reflective of what's happening. So it's important to keep this in mind about like, so that the exercise that we're doing and the tools that we're offering are not like imposing a model, a Western model, especially, about how things should be. And if they're not this way, then, they're wrong.
Yeah. Before I ask my question, I would like to remind the audience that they can actually ask you questions by typing it in the chat box, and we can actually also exchange the conversation with our two speakers. Talking about two things that you've mentioned. One, that this is about the context itself, that when you are covering the news, women will not go to these areas because this is the context as it is from a cultural aspect. The second thing, that people would think that, oh, you're bringing a Western tool and you're bringing something which is really Westerner to our societies, and this is not something that we want. How would you actually, deal with these kind of challenges?
Yeah, I can start, and then Hoda, please add anything. But I think the point that Hoda made is really our starting point. So for us, it's also a learning process. That was actually what we spent most of this first year of the program doing, is not developing a methodology, because actually we've done this kind of exercise before. There were methodologies in place, but really reflecting on it. Okay, but what does this look like? When we say gender stereotypes, are we going to misrepresent the quality of some articles by already saying, well, if it mentions... So for example, one of the classic things that comes forward a lot in gender media monitoring is the role placed about family roles around people. And so we had a bit of a discussion, okay, but in different contexts, it may be more normal to place someone in their family position. Is that actually a negative thing when it comes to gender? Or can we somehow highlight this in our report, that we're saying, okay, perhaps women are more often mentioned in a family role. Perhaps it's about the context of the story. If the context is irrelevant, if she's a mother, then it says something maybe about the gender roles. But if it is relevant to the context, why are we labeling it as something that's perhaps seen as negative? So these kind of discussions are really what we would also like to continue doing with media outlets, with journalists, sort of coming out of a bit our research box that we've been in now for a year. But also further to your point, I think one of the things that for me is really important, and also has been a long discussion with us, is how to maybe break this assumption that I think does live in many media outlets, that when you talk about gender stories or monitoring gender, it's about a particular type of story. So a gender story, it's 1, 2, 3, it's maybe about family, or it's about more societal topics. And one of the interesting things that we saw in the research is that actually women write about all sorts of topics. I say that with a small caveat, which is that it was very difficult in the research to actually know if a journalist was a man or a woman. So the reality might be a little bit different. But that's really where we want to highlight that, okay, you should actually interview women for any kind of story. You should try and identify not just how it impacts women, but different parts of society in any kind of story. And there, I think you get to this important point of actually what the stereotypes are, what the biases are. It's really context dependent to the type of story, to the country you're in. And we don't want to create some kind of checklist. We use some agreed upon indicators, for example, by UNESCO also, to sort of have some benchmark of, okay, making sure that this is still comparable, to international efforts on this. But again, the ambition of this program is not to create like a big report that is globally comparable, but more to create things that are adaptive, experimental also with media themselves.
I think Amy said it all.
Okay. So because Amy added all of that, so from an Arabic perspective, because we're talking here from a tool that is made in English and then it's translated into Arabic. So when you're doing the adaptation as a journalist, and when you're working with journalists, because it's not only about you doing that, it's also about training the journalists, what would be the level of actually interaction from one end? The second, how would be the level of actually acceptance of these tools that, you know, you're telling us what to do in the end?
So we at this stage, we haven't yet started like working with journalists to see what can be done. But I have to say that, like, you know, with regards to the language, everything was done in Arabic. The monitors, the journalists, you know, all, you know, are local Jordanian journalists. I myself speak Arabic, so the language is no problem at all. As far as the acceptance of the journalists, I think that the way that like Amy and I have been discussing this is, again, it's like more of a collaboration rather than a lecture on like these are mistakes and this is how you have to do it, but it comes from a place of understanding and of wanting. And I feel like the media, maybe not just the journalists, but you have to start with the media organizations being convinced that this is going to be something good for them. And it's easier, I think, to convince the journalists than to convince the editors or, you know, the media organizations. And I really, truly believe that it is something that will benefit them in many ways, and not just when it comes to gender or to women, but like I feel like if we go to the next stage with the gender media monitoring like exercise and start talking to the media outlets, it's going to actually make them conscious about many other aspects that are going to improve the reporting and the writing in many other ways.
So from this perspective, a question that I was reading from the audience is, what do you think about, you know, what were we able to achieve so far? I know that this is still at its beginning. You're still testing this tool, one. Second, when you are working with these tools, you are actually checking different imbalances and different kind of power structure within not only the content itself, also within the organization, as Huda said, because it's from top down, not only from the journalist aspect. So what do you, if you have any accomplishment that you feel that you have also achieved so far, or what do you feel in the future you will be able to achieve with the tool that will be maybe spread not only in Jordan, across the MENA region?
Yeah, thank you also for the person who shared this question. Actually, it's a nice bridge to introducing a little bit also where we are going. But first, to your first question about what we have so far, I think Hoda already alluded to it a little bit, but from this research, we do have some interesting conclusions and at least some hints as to where there is area for us to dig deeper and to understand more what's going on there. One of them is language. So we talked a lot also about what does gender-sensitive language look like, especially in Arabic, because that is something that, again, from the West, and particularly in English, we have certain assumptions of just basic use of language and what that reflects. But I think that a lot more work can be done into what that looks like in Arabic. Secondly, as Hoda also mentioned, there were some aspects of what came out of the research that we did that were not so much actually about the gender sensitivity, but also about a bigger picture of how, for example, interviews are done in articles, whether or not the journalist is named. So I think over 70% of the articles that we looked at, there was no named journalist. Mm-hmm. So this also actually really affects the data that we have, because we can have some really nice conclusions, but if we know that from 70% of the articles, we don't even know if it was written by a man or a woman, it does somewhat limit us. So I think this is also a conversation that we actually want to go into with media outlets to understand, okay, is there a reason for that? Is it a practical thing? Is it a security thing, perhaps? You know, to really sort of open some of these conclusions and understand them further. And to the second part of the question, as I say, our next step is really to reach out with media outlets and to work directly with them. And I think I fully agree with what Hoda says, that the important thing here is also to look sort of top at the higher level of a media outlet, so really at the editorial staff also. And this is what we will be doing in Jordan as well as in several other countries in the region, to really build a program that is not just looking at media monitoring, but media monitoring as one step in working together with outlets to really understand, okay, you know, how is the situation right now in the content you produce, but also in terms of staff. You know, what kind of stories are men writing in your organization? What kind of stories are the women writing? It will encompass also an element of coaching and leadership training for particularly women journalists in this case, but also this can be a bit needs-based based on the organization. There will be room for trainings, for example, on gender-sensitive reporting, and this is kind of frameworked by the gender media monitoring, because we really want to use this also, as I said, as a tool for outlets to understand themselves, okay, can I use this? You know, some outlets may use it on a daily basis or on a monthly basis, just to check in with their staff and their content to see, actually, I think quite often the intentions are already good, but a lot of what we see in the data, it's an unconscious continuation of some stereotypes, which can be because of capacity, it can be because of time. You know, if you're writing a lot of quick articles, you may not have time to do a lot of interviews with the people who are not maybe the most obvious candidates who you already have good contacts with. So also understanding all of these sort of practical matters that we can support media outlets with to improve some of these areas is really the next step that we want to look towards.
So in this perspective, we're bringing evidence-based approach to journalism, because people would think that, one, journalists are about opinion. Journalists bring their own perspective to things, and then you have the gender aspect. And they think that gender is something like spice or salt that you add to it, though it's part of life that we are living every day. From a perspective, from an opinion perspective, Huda, what do these tools bring to you as a journalist? Does this implicate you? You feel like you're burdened, or you feel like, oh, no, I'm learning actually, and it's changing me as a lifestyle, as an approach, because we all have to do this kind of exercise every day. Why we're writing this way and how. Sometimes we're overwhelmed. How do we do this kind of thinking when we are overwhelmed, actually? Maybe can be a tip for the journalists when you are really under pressure writing about conflicts. How would you remember that you have to gender mainstream your content?
Thank you for the question, Ruba, and I think definitely the latter. I think it's definitely going to help journalists, and I want to reveal maybe a little bit more about some of the conclusions that we came up with. I think when I was looking at the data, like I said, like we had over 230 articles, and we're trying to do all sorts of analysis and think of like intelligent questions to ask of the data to figure out like what to, and what I had an aha moment where I'm like, oh my God, a lot of the issues that we saw were related to following just good practice like journalism, unrelated completely to gender. For example, interviewing everyone who is like part of the story. So there was a story about domestic workers, and there were so many opinions, but there was not one domestic worker interviewed. And this is just basic, following just basic journalism, good practices. So this was one of. Another thing also that I want to mention is the pictures. We've had, so we would analyze like what picture is being used with the article, and we've had like some really good pictures where women were very well represented. And I remember one, there was, I think,
أتذكر عندما أذكر في برنامج يتعلق بالفضاء كان أو معظم النساء كنا سيدات. لذا ليس كل شيء يتعلق فقط بتنميط أو الواضح جدا الذي يعكس المجتمع إذا كان يراعي أو تم إدخاله أو إقحامه في هذا المقال. لهذا علينا أن نقنع وسائل الإعلام والصحفيين بأن هذا يجب أنه هذا بمحط اهتمامهم. لذا يمكن أن نقدم لهم طرق وهي لا يتطلب الكثير من التدريب المحدد للتحسين أو للتحسن أو للتطور. أود أن أسألكم بناء على فكرة خاصة فيما يتعلق بهدى في عملك على المشاريع، كيف تحسنين أو كيف تتدربين وتحسنين خبرتك وتجاربك خاصة فيما يتعلق في التحقق من البيانات التي فيها هذا النوع من المحتوى؟ هل تغيرين نهجك أو أسلوبك عندما تكونين في سياق العمل أو في لديك قائمة تحدد قائمة تحقق معينة؟ كيف تتعامل هذه مجموعة الأدوات تغير من عملك أو من طريقة تفكيرك؟
علينا أن أن نكون واقعيين. أعتقد أن بالتأكيد نحاول أن نكون مرنين في برامجنا. أعتقد أن هذا الشيء يمكن أن يكون شيئا صعبا عندما تأخذنا من وجهة نظر بحثية، فإن التحوير قد يكون غير مرغوب ربما، لأنك تريد شيئا ممكن مقارنة به أو تقيس عليه، لا تريد أن تعبث بالأسئلة وهكذا يتم تقييمها. قمنا بذلك في سياقات مختلفة أيضا في مراقبة الإعلام بشكل عالمي، ولكنها ليست أولوية بالنسبة لنا خصوصا في هذا البرنامج. أعتقد حتى في هذا البحث الذي قمنا به ولم نصل بعض إلى مرحلة العمل مع المؤسسات الإعلامية، لأن قمنا بالعمل من برنامج موجود مثلا في مالي وفي بنغلاديش وسياقات مختلفة أخرى، وكل واحد منها الطريقة الذي عمل هناك كان مرتبط مع صحفيين وشركاء إعلاميين، ونحاول أن نفهم خلال ذلك. نعم، لديكم الآن هذه الأدوات، هل تفهمونها؟ هل هي مهمة بالنسبة لكم؟ نحن الآن في هذه المرحلة ولم زلنا نحاول تحوير هذه الأدوات لتكون ملائمة لتلك السياقات المختلفة. ليس دائما هم لا يفهمون، لكنهم لا يتفقون معنا. ربما هناك نوع معين، وعندما نقوم بوضع اللائحة قد تكون غير مناسبة بالنسبة لهم. قد يكون بعض الإشارات، بعض خيارات المختلفة يجب أن تكون موجودة. قد وضعنا هناك الكثير من الأشياء، أحيانا بعض البيانات تكون غير مفيدة. يقول الصحفيين نحن نفتقد شيئا مهما غير موجود هنا. هناك بعض القصص عن مثلا كان لدينا الكثير من النساء ممثلات بالجانب السياسي. لم نكن نعلم هذه البيانات فافتقدنا وجود ذلك في قائمتنا. لقد رأينا بعض البيانات المثيرة للاهتمام، وعلينا أن نتأكد أنها موجودة في طرقنا. وأيضا أريد أن أذكر ما سيحدث لاحقا. بإمكانك وضع أي سؤال يكون مهما بالنسبة للسياق الذي أنت تعمل به. قد ربما نتفحص بعض التمييز، التنميط. عندما نقول مراقبة ونقوم بهذه الممارسة، يجب أن نقلب أن نقول أن الصحفيين أو المحررين الذين يعملون داخليا في المؤسسات الإعلامية قد يقومون بذلك في المستقبل. عليك أن تفكر في كل نقطة هي مهمة بالنسبة لك. قد يكون أي شيء يكون مثيرا لتطوير المحتوى ولتطوير إذا كان مراعيا لبعض الثقافات المحلية. هل نحن نكتب هذه المقال بشكل مناسب لكي يفهمه شباب مثلا؟ وهذا هو جمال هذه الأداة. لذلك في نهاية جلستنا أريد أن أشكركم، لكن قبل ذلك ما فهمته من هذا النقاش أن أهمية الحصول على هذه الأداة، لكن ليس فقط لتخبرنا ما نقوم به، بل على العكس بإمكاننا تحويرها لتكون مناسبة بما يناسب لما السياق الذي نعمل فيه. سؤالي الأخير لكما أنتم الآن وبشكل سريع، ما زال لدينا دقيقة واحدة فقط. دائما حول التأثير، عندما كيف نتأثر بشيء وكيف نؤثر على الآخرين. كيف يجعلكم هذا الآخرين تعملون بشكل أفضل من وجهة نظركم كصانعين لهذا المشروع، ومن وجهة نظركم كصحفيين كيف تفكرون؟ هل أنتم تنتقلون بين الشرق والغرب؟ كيف تعملون؟ كيف تعتقدون أن هذه الأدوات تغيركم وتغير وجهة النظر اللي تعملون بها؟ سرعة رجاء.
أعرف أن الصحفيين الذين يقومون بالرصد بعضهم مشاركين هنا في هذه الغرفة. أريد أن أشكركم جميعا، وأعرف أنه لديكم الكثير من الملاحظات والأشياء فيما قمتم به. أيضا لديكم تغذية راجعة كثيرة، وهم أنفسهم وأنا نفسي بيننا نقوم بذلك. يمكن أن نعرف كيف يمكن لذلك أن يكون شيئا يعمل على تحسين عملهم. نعم، أعتقد وخاصة ما يتعلق عندما نتحدث عن كل هذه الأشياء التي ذكرناها حول التكيف والعمل مع الوسائل الإعلامية واحتياجاتها. هناك أشياء كثيرة أقوم بها بالتحديد للتأكد من أن التأثير موجود، ولا نريد طبعا أن نركز فقط على وسائل الإعلام التي لديها فعليا هي كأبطال أو ريادية في هذا المجال العملي، نريد الآخرين أيضا. وكذلك كما قلت هذا الشيء في DNA أو في جينات الإعلام، لذا جميعنا نعمل على هذا، جميع وسائل الإعلام تعمل على هذه المواضيع. لذا ملاحظة أين ممكن أن يكون هناك مجال للتحسين أو للتطور، وكذلك من خلال التعاون يمكننا أن يكون تأثيرنا أو أثرنا أكثر بكثير، وربما نعمل لمدة نصف سنة وينتهي. أعتقد هذا ليس الأثر الذي نريده. نريد هذا الأثر أن يكون مستداما بين الصحفيين والمؤسسات الإعلامية، بأن تكون هذا شيء دائما موجود معهم، الديمومة. أود أن أنهي هنا لأننا انتهينا. أود أن أشكركم من فري بريس أنليميتد وأريج لكل هذه الوسائل المتاحة للجمهور والتي يمكن استخدامها في المستقبل، وبعد أن قمتم بتفحصها نود أن نراها تنتشر ليس فقط في الأردن ولكن في منطقة الشرق الأوسط وشمال أفريقيا. شكرا ربا، وشكرا لمشاركتكم وحضوركم هذه الجلسة ومشاهدتكم جميعا. شكرا.